start until they move forward.
Yeah, the ones that say screen, that'll turn the ones that are off right above you.
I learned something new today.
Good evening, everyone. With a quorum of members present, I'll call the Finance Committee for Thursday, October 10th, 2019 to order. We have one item on our agenda tonight. Today is the second in a series of 2020 budget sessions. This is a workshop session where the Finance Committee will work on and consider options for the 2020 budget and fee schedule before we proceed forward to council with any of it. So welcome, everyone, and we'll expect at least a third meeting yet in this series as well. Mary Ann's got a PowerPoint to show us, so we'll start there.
Thank you. So the PowerPoint as well as the budget book are on the city's website. And within your PowerPoint packet today is the slides from the last meeting. So when we get to that, I'll just skip over those slides since we covered them at the last meeting. I don't want you to have to listen to that again.
What page do you start on?
You'll start on page 1, and then when we get to the page that we're going to skip, I'll let you know. I think at page 31, we'll skip to page 64. So I guess the budget that is presented today has a levy of $29,505,177, which is a $1.6 million increase from last year's levy, or a 5.92% increase in the levy. So this is the dollars that we generate for the budget for 2020. And the levy is used by a variety of funds, the general fund being the largest benefactor, and then the debt service fund is the second at about $4 million. So the general fund is nearly $19 million. The debt service fund is $4 million, and then the next largest fund to utilize is our tax increment districts, followed by Metro Ride.
So that percentage that we show for 2020 at 5.92 is in part reflective of a growth in tax base and not
Yes.
strictly in mill rate increase?
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear on that because I didn't want anyone to think we were rolling out a 6% mill rate increase, not reflective of any growth and additional taxes coming in.
Right.
Okay.
And I do have a slide on that. So if you look at the changes in the levy, you can see that the general fund, which is our operating fund where all of our services that we provide to the constituents, police, fire, parks, public works are located, that levy is expected to go up 2.76%. The Metro Ride, an additional $284,000, 34%. The parking fund, we've increased about 110%. And then our tax increment districts, 23%. So you can see that of the increases, the tax increment districts are $650,000. That's the largest increase, followed by the general fund and then the Metro Ride. When we look at the TID levy, you can see, if you remember, when we levy for our tax increment districts, we're levying in that growth area for the school, the county, the technical college revenues as well. So the increment that we're expecting to receive as part of the 2020 budget is $9.5 million. Now that's an estimate at this point because we don't really know what the tax rate is going to be for the school, the county, and the technical college. But if you compare that to the actual increment in 2019, that's about a $1.7 million increase. And of course, if you look at TID 11, that increment in 2020 is 1.5 million compared to 42,000. So as Lisa was saying just a few minutes ago, that's where Great Lakes Cheese is. And so that is a huge growth area in value for the city. So while we're generating a lot of new taxes, it's not going to have an impact on the typical homeowner because it's new tax base that we're taxing. So the increment is expected to go up about $1.7 million, and the city's share of that is about 36%. So that if you would calculate that, that's that 650,000 that we showed at a previous slide of how much our share of the increment has to go up. So again, as Lisa pointed out, we not only tax the values of the properties that existed last year, but we're going to be able to collect tax on the new values, the growth that occurred from last year's budget to this year's budget. And we had record growth this year. This slide shows what our net new construction, so that would be new construction less if property was cleared and any improvements were removed from that, it would be net of that. So we were at a 4% increase in 2020. And, we've had some good growth the last couple of years, but you can see that we're nearly double the 2019 growth. So some record-breaking growth, and that new value becomes new tax base, so we can generate more levy without it having an impact to an individual tax parcel. So of course, when we're doing our budget, we have to comply with the levy limit rules. So based on the levy limit rules, we can increase on net new construction. So that calculation would generate $839,472 of new value for us, and our current increase is $999,000. So we're a little above that. Typically, how we've managed that process is there is an exemption for debt payments. So our levy is 4.1 million. So we're allowed to use up to that 4.1 million as an exemption. So you can see I've provided in this slide kind of a history of what we've been using of that debt exemption. So last year we used 1.5 million or almost 1.6 million of that exemption. That exemption that we would need would actually go down this year to 1.4 million. So again, kind of trying to present the growth that we've experienced this year. The state of Wisconsin is a dual value state. So there's an equalized value, and the equalized value is managed by the state of Wisconsin. And the word equalized is very important because you have each taxing jurisdiction has their own local assessor, and they have, while there are rules that that the objective is to have not only a fair and equitable assessment, but that we all are kind of following the same practices. But you can see that there would be differences from assessor to assessor and where they are in their revaluation process, things like that. And so the equalized value is established by the state, and that is calculated by the state by looking at sales data and comparing what value we have on a parcel versus what it's sold at. And then they take that information and come up with basically a fair market value of the entire city by extrapolating that sales data through statistic formulas to put that blanket over all of the properties. So from an equalized standpoint, our value went up 6.19%. Again, a very strong increase for us. And our assessed value, which all of the property but for the manufacturing property is developed by our local assessor. So we're using an estimate today because we have not received the manufacturing values from the state of Wisconsin. So our estimate is that our assessed value is going up 3.81%. And again, if you look at the last few years, last year was kind of an anomaly because The state eliminated one category of personal property tax, and we lost about $28 million of value. But you can see a nearly 4% increase in our assessed valuation. Again, new tax base that is sharing the burden of our levy this year. So we've been talking about that new value, and we talked about the levy. So then what does that mean to a homeowner who is going to get their tax bill from the city? And again, the tax bill is the city's taxes, the county's taxes, the schools, and the technical colleges. So we're talking just about the city's taxes. So last year, our tax rate was $10.27 on an assessed value. Based on the budget that's been submitted to date, that would go up to $10.48. That would be a 20.8-cent increase, or about a 2.03% increase. So again, that's based on that estimated value. And then the equalized tax rate, because when the school district publishes their tax rate in the newspaper, or the county or the technical college, they're using that equalized tax rate because they're distributing their levy over multiple jurisdictions. So they use equalized. So our equalized tax rate is actually, based on the budget that we've submitted, is going to go down 2 cents. So I know that's always kind of a weird concept to think about, but comparing apples to apples, when you hear stories of the school's tax rate or the county's, that's always on an equalized basis.
Is the county's tax on equalized value too then?
Yes.
Okay.
So we usually focus a lot on our general fund. Again, that's where all of our big services are provided through, and it's the largest operating fund we have. So from a revenue standpoint, you can see that the general fund relies heavily on property taxes. Nearly 54% of the revenue stream to the general fund is property taxes. And then the next category is our grants, our shared revenue, our transportation aids, things that we get from the state of Wisconsin. That's at 25.51. And then all of our other revenues are minor in comparison. And so over the years, one of the big struggles that we have been faced with is stagnant revenues. And that results in us having to rely more and more on property taxes to pay for any increase in service costs. And as you can see by this chart that compares our revenues in the general fund from this year to last year's budget, you can see that that's true again this year. Though there is one shining point, and that is we did receive an increase this year of about $185,000 in state aids, and that is largely due to transportation aids. But when you net all of the other revenue sources that we have here, we're looking at about $118,000 growth. So when our budget is $35 million and we have new revenues of $118,000, you can see that that's pushing a larger burden onto our reliance on property taxes, and that's why it's really important that we have a strong economic development program, because we need to generate new value so that there's a larger tax base. And, you know, as I pointed out in our budget book, that's particularly important for the city of Wausau because we have such limited other revenue sources. When you look at other communities, they have worked really hard to diversify their revenues. So they have a stormwater utility. They maybe have their registration on vehicles. They would have their garbage as a separate charge. And we have none of those revenues, so we just have our property taxes. So economic development is very, very important to the city.
I have just a quick comment, because as we were going down the road of talking about stormwater utilities and separate refuse charges and things, I hope that people will take time to go online and read the 2020 budget overview that's in the front of our budget books. We've all received it on paper. But when we talk about general property taxes, there's something in there that's very telling. And in the early 2000s, we adopted direct legislation in Wausau that prohibits us from adding any new fees for service without going to public referendum. And we've left that legislation in place. But although well-intentioned, economically, that has put us at a disadvantage when slated against our peers that don't have that legislation. In the budget book, the sentences that pertain to it read as follow. The City of Wausau's direct legislation has limited any additional revenue options without approval by referendum. This means that residents pay for all services based upon the value of their property without regard to the consumption of the service or the relationship to the cost of the service. A great example is refuse and recycling services. Many communities bill this service as an extra charge on a utility bill or a separate charge on a tax bill. Communities bill on average $150 to $200 per household. They all get the same trash pickup. In the City of Wausau, the cost is included in the tax rate and is recovered through real estate taxes, resulting in taxpayers paying a disparate amount. So we have some people that pay $14 a year for garbage pickup, and we have other people that pay over $800 a year for the exact same garbage pickup, the same container, perhaps the same volume of garbage. And so that same thing is true with stormwater. Our residential taxpayers are bearing the weight of all of the commercial entities' runoff because that still is built in our mill rate. So that direct legislation, I think, was very well-intentioned, but it has hamstrung us economically for over 10 years now. And, anytime we've ever talked about repealing and overturning that direct legislation, there is quite an uproar by the folks who furthered that. But I think if we look at where the rubber meets the road and what the real economic impact of that has been, there are an awful lot of our residents and our constituents that are overpaying for services like garbage when they don't need to be, when someone else, produces the same volume of trash and is allowed to get by for $14. So that's very telling, and I hope that we have discussions in our neighborhoods about that, because someday I think we're going to get to a point where when that all comes to a head from a budget standpoint, some council at some point is going to have to decide if that's worth continuing truly. And, it's not us tonight, and it's probably not us in this budget cycle, but it's very telling, and I hope that people will read through that booklet and see that analysis, because it's, when we went to referendum on stormwater and garbage a couple years ago, that was hotly voted down, but when you go out in the neighborhoods and have conversations with people and explain what the impact is, then people would say, well, if I knew that, I would have voted for it. Well, but yet you host a half a dozen public meetings and people don't come, so, that failed referendum, I think, was somewhat of a skewed result because the facts weren't understood. And I think we need to be good stewards of that information and get that information out so that people really understand it. So that's just my 2 cents on refuse and recycling, because it's really expensive in here.
So I also want to point out this bottom, the fund balance application, you can see $312,000 as a revenue source to the 2020 budget that wasn't in 2019. And I have a slide to explain that, but I just wanted to point out that really isn't a true new revenue, but it would be a way to provide funding in the 2020 budget. So when we met the last time over the budget, we discussed the fact that Tax Increment District 5, its last increment will be collected in 2020. And the increment revenue for the district is about $912,000. So the city's share of that increment, remember I said we're about 36 to 37% of that, is the $328,000. So that money would be available for the 2021 budget, not the 2020 budget. But one option that we could consider is to apply a one-time fund balance application in the 2020 budget that would be used to, diminish our tax increase. And generally speaking, you wouldn't recommend a one-time revenue source, but given that that TID would close in 2021, if the council so chose, that district's increment would then be available in the future years to replace this one-time fund balance application. So this is one strategy that you could use, and it's built into this budget today. So if we removed it, we would either have to reduce our expenses or find another revenue source to replace it. One strategy that you could use to minimize the tax impact. Another I guess, reason for proposing this is when we looked at our financial condition at the end of 2018, we discussed, and our auditor presented this, we presented it at our year-end financial results, that we've had a number of very good years. So you can see that our general fund has been growing, and we are predicting another profit this year between $800 and $1 million. So that general fund undesignated fund balance is going to continue to grow. So in this comparison, the undesignated or unassigned fund balance, that's basically the rainy day fund, started at $4.3 million in 2014 and has nearly doubled to $8.1 million in 2018. So you can see that that $300,000 application certainly would not impact the health of the city from the general fund's standpoint. It would help defray our costs, and then we would replace that with the increment that would be available when the TID closed in 2021. So again, this would just be one strategy that you could use, but it was built into the budget.
It certainly makes sense to consider that as a cost containment measure, because we know that when we close the district on time, we will have funds to replenish the rainy day fund that we've utilized this year. But given that, then we as a council will need to commit to actually closing TID 5 on time and not exercising our option to collect that extra year of increment that I talked about in our last session. I mean, there's other TIDs coming up to close in the coming years that we certainly could consider something like that, but we would have to commit that we would not keep that TID open that extra year to use that increment for housing blight or whatever. We would need to really close it, replenish the rainy day fund, and then let the rest of it go to the general fund as planned. So, when we talked about it last week, we certainly were not interested in doing it on every single district that closes, but it's an option. But we should then resign ourselves to not do that next year then.
So we talked about that we did actually get some growth in our state aids this year. You can see, again, these are our major four state aids that historically we have relied on. Again, to point out that in 2010, our shared revenues were $4.6 million. In 2020, they're at just over $4 million. So we lost about $650,000 between the years of 2011 and 2012. The state has never returned those funds to us. And shared revenue, by its very terminology, was designed because if you look across the United States, there are states that allow municipalities to have an income tax. And the state of Wisconsin said, we're not going to have that situation in the state. The state will have an income tax, and they will share that revenue with all of its local jurisdictions. That's why it's called shared revenue. And so they were supposed to share that revenue with us. And of course, as they have experienced financial difficulties, one of their favorite places to raid is shared revenues. So back during a time when, they were experiencing financial difficulties, and truly, if we went back further than 2010, you would see that they were even substantially higher in earlier years, our shared revenue was, but we've never received much of an increase. You can see that it's kind of languished at that $4 million rate since 2011, and we've never recovered from there. As well as the expenditure restraint, which this was part of the shared revenue pot, and so they carved out a section of it. And it was really to encourage municipalities to control their costs. And if we control our costs, we're rewarded by the state of Wisconsin through the expenditure restraint program. And there again, we at one point enjoyed a higher dollar amount, and that had an inflation figure in that pool of money. So the state basically at some point said we're not going to increase that pool. And again, we've been basically sticking around that $800,000 mark, 850, since the, 2017. But we did at one time enjoy a higher amount. The transportation aids is one area where we have seen some growth. Last year, we got about $200-some thousand from the state. And again, this year, we're successful in raising another $200,000. And again, the city has been successful in increasing it because it is partially based on your investment in transportation costs. So all of these big street projects that we've been doing the last couple of years have helped us in this area because they see our investment in the roads, and then they reward us by giving us a little bit bump in aids, and they increase the pool overall as well. And then payment for municipal services, this basically is a pilot payment for the fact that we have the UW campus and another state building within our boundaries. Two newer state aid payments that we get are our personal property aid and our pilot computer aid. Both of these relate to personal property tax that the state eliminated a category of PP for businesses and then said that they would make us whole from that change. But again, there's no growth there then. So, for example, Great Lakes Cheese, Wausau Chemical are investing significant dollars into their personal property, but we don't get to see that growth because this is basically a frozen aid for us now. And you can see that our PP for the personal property actually went down a bit in both categories.
So are we looking at then a point-in-time freeze going forward in perpetuity at amounts like this? Or will
Yes.
it continue to step down
It will be frozen,
at these amounts? Wow.
yeah. So as I said, the other areas of change in our revenues in the general fund are limited. A couple of points of interest. So we took out the mall rent of $76,000. We did bump up our interest income about $175,000 because we have been doing well. And while interest rates have dropped a bit, they still are higher than we've experienced in what our budget was based on. We did bump up the license permit revenues just a small amount. And then we didn't show any increase in our other financing sources. Of course, room tax, again, the legislature has frozen how we can use kind of our general fund room tax. So that is a frozen amount. And we didn't show any increase in the payments that we get from the utility or from the motor pool. So moving on to expenses, basically, this is just a pie chart to show that, the major areas of expenditure for us in the general fund, again, our service departments, the fire, police, and public works. Our expenses in the general fund to date are going up $1,145,000 from last year. That's about a 3.36% increase from last year. The major budget influences, we have an 8% increase in this for health insurance in the budget. We met with our insurance consultants earlier this summer, and they had actually predicted about a 6% increase. We met with them about 2 weeks ago, and they had bad news for us. At that point, they were looking at about low 20-some% increase. We sent them back to the drawing board, and it's early, you know, it's really hard from a budgeting standpoint with health insurance, because health insurance companies, the longer we wait to set our, for them to give us our estimate, usually the less conservative they are, because the more information they have, the better they feel about the rates that they're willing to commit to. And so, you know, we have over the years, when we have a tough year like it looks like this year is going to be, allowed them more time to see how claims are going to fall, and to work with our insurance carriers a little bit more to see if they can be a little bit more competitive. Of course, we're self-insured, so really the insurance that we're looking for is that stop loss on the high claims. So right now, our stop loss is $70,000. So if a claim exceeds $70,000 in a year, then that reinsurance takes over. So that's really what we're working on, and to see if there's any other things that we can look at to help us save money on our insurance. So we were to have a meeting today with them. They asked for more time, which we granted, but we're hoping to have more information for the next regular finance committee meeting. So our union contract increases are built into the budget, as well as the salary step progression. We experienced an increase in the Wisconsin retirement rates. Those are built into the budget, and our dental insurance proposal came in flat, so no increase for dental insurance. Other things that we've got built into the budget are water and sewer utility increases, so all of the departments that are paying water and sewer have those built in. We've been adding $50,000 to the seal coat budget every year, a variety of equipment charges, some increase in registration and tuition, emerald ash borer treatments for our street trees and park trees, and then riverfront expenses for operations. So those are the major influences in the general fund budget that are increasing costs. Oops, I hit the wrong button. Wait.
Now, depending on what happens with that health insurance, if we're way far off the mark, you know, we'd committed to every year, we were adding 50,000 to seal coat. We certainly were never reducing the amount anymore that we had put in for seal coat, but that fund continues to get bigger and bigger, so we can do more and more. And from an infrastructure standpoint, that does extend the life of the street, and it does stave off expensive rebuilds. But if we get to a point where we really are up against a wall with this health insurance thing, is it an option for us to consider to hold the line on that fund for 1 year and maybe not add that $50,000 infusion? That's 2 cents on the mill rate. So, you know, maybe that's something we should keep in the back of our mind if we're looking for an extra option, is to hold that fund steady, not reduce it, but maybe not infuse this year if we really can't afford to. If we'd have that option, we'd have to see.
So looking at the expense budget by categories, you can see that the general government budget actually went up very little, $14,000, or a 0.33% increase. One of the things that I've built into the budget, this is something that we talked about, that we experience within our department, is the election budget. So you can see that when we have, excuse me, different levels of election each year, that we have expenses that go up and down quite dramatically given the size of the elections. And that creates a problem from a budgeting standpoint, because in 2019, we budgeted only $28,000 for elections, but now this year we have to raise an additional $100,000 because we have such big elections in 2020. And then the following year, it will drop back down. So I'm proposing and have built into this budget that we would do a stabilized election budget. So we would budget kind of a medium cost each year, and then we would carry over that surplus from year to year so that we don't have to try to raise the levy in one year by $100,000. So that has been built into this budget, a stabilized election budget. Public safety, both police and fire are going up a little over 3% for an average of 3.45% increase from the 2019 budget. Parks and Public Works, the Public Works budget, 3.7% increase, and the Parks budget is a 7.9% increase. We are likely going to reduce that. In the past, we've been funding some of that riverfront budget out of the room tax fund because we felt that and we've been using that 400 block fund. And so we are working with the Parks Department to isolate what those costs are, and we'll be proposing that we shift those out. So that will be something where you'll see some relief in the general fund in the coming meetings. So when you look at the general fund by category rather than department, you can see that personnel service costs are a huge component. Again, we are a service agency, and so that is reflected in our expenses. So when we slice the general fund budget by expense category, again, you can see that we've controlled costs in most areas, and that our personal service area is where we're experiencing the financial pressure. Again, it's the cost of living, I guess, for a lack of a better term, for salaries. It's the new positions that we added last year, and it would be that health insurance and the Wisconsin retirement system costs that are pushing that increase in the budget. Just to kind of show, again, very reflective of the department budgets. Those departments who have more employees, of course, have larger budgets. So we talked before about one of the one of the revenues that we receive is expenditure restraint. As I said, it's a reward to communities who are able to control their costs. The formula that they use for the expenditure restraint is we're able to increase our general fund expenditures and the levies of other funds up to 60% of our net new construction plus CPI. So our net new construction was 4%, so we get about 2.4% of an increase in the budget for net new construction. And then our CPI, we, in this slide, I built in 1.85% because that's what they were estimating earlier, because it's based on September CPI. And we did receive something from the league today that they thought that 1.85 was correct. So this is an accurate estimate. So right now, we're slightly over our expenditure restraint dollars. But again, moving the parks budget out of the general fund for the river and some other fine tuning that we need to do will get us in line with that.
Would that include maintenance costs for East Bay Complex as well? Since that obviously is bringing in quite a bit of room tax, or no?
Because that's a county
It is
facility,
still?
so we
Okay.
don't have to pay for
So we
that.
don't have, okay.
So our special revenue funds, all of them have a revenue source, so generally we don't focus heavily on the special revenue funds during budget time. The recycling fund is one area where we do put quite a bit of property taxes. That fund is relatively flat when we look at this year compared to next year. So not a huge difference in our levies for our special revenue funds. Again, I covered that legislation fixed the amount of room tax that we could use for operations. You can see that we've been experiencing a steady climb in room tax revenues. We don't get to enjoy that increase in our operating budget. Due to that levy tax legislation, we actually have to limit, and there was basically a step down. So in 2014, 506,000 of that could be used at our discretion. For the 2019 budget, we had 461,000 at our discretion, and now in the 2020 budget, it's 431,000, and it's all a formula based on the actual room tax that we received in each one of these years. So it looks back at 2011 to see what room tax we received. But we will have more discretion in the 2021 year because in 2010 we got a little bit more room tax, so it will go up to 444,000. And then that will be the number that, that we will be able to use at our discretion for basically forever then. So now if you're following along on your PowerPoint, now we've reached the capital projects funds that we covered at the last meeting, so you would want to move to page 64 in your packet, because between 31 and 64 are all the slides that we covered the last meeting. So our internal service funds are our insurance fund, the motor pool fund, and the employee benefits fund. So the insurance fund is where we're funding all of our CIVMIC premiums, our self-insured workers' compensation, those types of costs, and then we take those costs, accumulate them in this fund, and then allocate them back to the department as a special charge. The motor pool fund is accounted for the same way. So it is the fund that pays for the mechanics, it pays for all of the fuel, all of the parts, the replacement of rolling stock, and then through a motor pool charge, we allocate that back to the departments based on their use of those vehicles. And then the employee benefit fund is the same way, so it's paying for all of our insurance claims for health, dental, any other insurance, and then those are charged back to the department. So an internal service fund is basically just accumulating costs that are then allocated to departments. So when we look at our enterprise funds, generally speaking, the enterprise fund is supposed to be functioning as a business and recovering the majority of its costs through user fees. When we, in 2011, moved Metro Ride from a special revenue fund to an enterprise fund, and the reason we did that was we found that most other communities were accounting for it as an enterprise fund. And so when we would have people try to compare our general fund or our special revenue funds to other communities, we looked out of whack. So for comparability amongst all other communities in the state, we moved it to an enterprise fund. But this activity definitely relies heavily on the levy and on state aids. So the expenses for the 2020 budget are $3.6 million, up about, I think it was $150-some thousand from last year. The levy has a significant increase up to 1.1 million, and when they generate a surplus, they retain that within the fund at any given year. So if they've budgeted conservatively and they make more money because we've levied based on a more conservative budget, that stays with the fund, and that has accumulated. They've got about $400-some thousand as kind of a surplus within that fund. And because they levy or they budget conservatively, we generally don't levy the full amount. And so this year we've said we're going to reserve use about $131,000 of reserves. Last year, I think we budgeted to use about $200,000 of reserves, so a little bit less this year. When we look at the Metro Ride budget, you can see that their expenses have not gone up dramatically from one year to the next. 3.5 million last year to 3.6 million this year. It's their revenue distribution that really is having an impact on us. So you can see that in the 2019 budget, their budget was supported almost 57% by state aids. This year, that's down to 55%. So we've had to actually levy for some of the budget that was funded by the state and federal government last year, as well as then fund the increase in expenses. The other area of concern is the public charges for services, which is your rider fees. The 2019 budget expected $428,000, or 12% of the budget, to be recovered through rider fees. This year, just slightly over 10%, so another reduction in revenues, which then forces us to increase the levy. So we're looking at a substantial levy increase in the Metro Ride.
Now, this is a tough one because, you know, it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing. I mean, we've been working so hard to attract intergovernmental cooperation through our neighboring communities to expand Metro Ride, you know, to make it regional again and, you know, get it back to the status that it once held. And that's been, you know, very difficult because that partnership has not been materializing. But, you know, if we continue on this trend, are we going to have to face or look at either fare adjustments or route changes, or both, to sustain? I mean, at some point, we're not going to have enough reserve to keep bolstering the fund with. So is that something that we have to consider this year even?
I think that the Transit Commission is going to be considering that. I don't
Are
know,
they?
Greg, if you want to come up and speak to that.
Because I think we were so hoping that we would see at least some inkling in the community back toward regionalization, and that progress has been so slow.
Yeah, I don't see any inkling toward a regional service. You know, the fact that we are funded by more than 50% without outside funding is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing when the revenue stream is consistent, but it's a curse when you're trying to make adjustments when it goes down. The reason our passenger revenue is going down is because ridership is declining. We're down about 8% this year. And so I'm doing making some proposals to the Transit Commission for next week's meeting. However, we're not going to produce a whole lot of additional revenue because ridership is declining. When we increase revenue, ridership declines. We're already declining, so it will be a decline on top of a declining trend. And so there will be a little more revenue, but it's not going to be a whole lot. On the expense side, I've done several different scenarios. The biggest problem we have is there's no fat on the bone anymore. Our services are already so minimal. Any cuts we make will be very painful. I've done several scenarios to provide to the Transit Commission for next week, and one of them actually increases costs because it's a shared route with Northern Valley Industries. You know, when the city's share of our budget is a third of every dollar spent, you have to cut a whole lot to make a real impact.
Well, and I struggle with a fare increase because right now the brunt of our riders are riders by necessity, and we've not seen that uptick in riders by choice that we were so seeking. And so, you know, you really add to everyone's pain if we increase the cost to utilize a service that they're all dependent on, where they've got no choice and no other options. You know, and like you said, a decline on top of a decline is just a recipe for failure too. So hopefully we can figure something out, but that is not a bright picture. So I was hoping that we'd have some more positive results from the efforts of the MPO, but they've been at it for a year, and we've just not seen that buy-in.
Well, this week's, what do they call that committee? Citizens Transit Advisory Committee. They've decided to disband the current format of the committee and kind of start over because they're not getting any traction.
We actually considered at the council retreat, trying to figure out if there was something that we could do as a council at the local level, because the council is looking to find a way to impact and expand the transit system, and we were concerned that the MPO effort was not fast enough, and we were wondering if there was something that we can do in parallel, without turning off our neighboring communities to that collaborative effort, to take some of the politics out of it, but still move it forward. And so I think there's interest within our own chamber as well as to figure out what we can do, without harming the cause. So if there's a group to be reformed, maybe that's a blessing too. So, all right, thanks for that insight though, Greg.
You're welcome.
So the Wausau Downtown Airport Fund is another enterprise fund. Its expenses are $458,000. The levy is $125,000. And this fund has virtually no reserves built up, only $15,000 in reserves. And so, our goal has been to try to build up the levy a little bit each year, just to try to help. It's a very asset-intensive operation, so, they have a number of hangars that have a lot of maintenance costs, and it's hard to anticipate what some of those maintenance costs are going to be. We have some old and aging hangars. They have doors that are large for airplanes to get in and out of. They require a lot of maintenance. And so, we've been trying to, bolster that fund up. So this has a levy increase of $24,000 in it from last year, but not a huge increase in its expenses.
Now, the property tax value that we gain from private hangar construction out there comes into this fund?
We don't isolate that specifically, we just levy for what we think we need. I think in the budget book, it does say,
Because I guess
Let's see if I can find that.
I would be interested to see if, as we start to develop the East Hangar development area with private hangars, and secure more property tax revenue from those hangar owners, if some of that fund could be earmarked to bolster that reserve a little bit so they're not quite so dependent
Sure.
on the levy as we go forward. I mean, there's a few hangars planned for that east side that are decent in size, that could help us there.
And then the parking fund is another enterprise fund, about $1.5 million. As I said, last year's levy was $50,000. We've more than doubled that. And it too has a small reserve, and this is all of our parking operations. When you look at the fund, and I know maybe from far away it's kind of hard to see, but this top bar is the expenses. And we are predicting our expenses to go down in 2020. And there are a number of reasons for that decrease in expense. We replaced all of the lighting in the Pennies and Sears ramps with LED. And so we are and you can imagine that lighting is a huge cost for our parking ramps. And so we're expecting about a 70% decrease in our lighting costs in those ramps. We do have in our capital budget to replace the lighting in the Jefferson ramp. Usually your payback is about 2 years for LED lighting. And of course, they last, nearly, forever. Yes, so it's a very wise financial move for us. So that's one of the areas that we're expecting a decrease in expenses. Another major area is in our parking cashiers in the Pennies and Sears ramp. We're going to be eliminating the cashier operations and going with pay stations, so those salaries would come out, not all of the employees, but all of the part-time and one full-time employee that's retiring soon. And then another area where we're seeing some decreases, we had been allocating some of the police administrative time to this fund, and we stopped that in the preparation of the 2020 budget. But then the other charts show revenues, and the next highest bar really is our parking fees. And you can see that those since 2014 have declined, but somewhat stabilized, but really declining again in 2020. And that reflects the loss of the parking payment that we were getting from the mall. So we'll be looking at, a number of other strategies to minimize the costs. One of the other things is to allocate these old parking cashier people will be doing other things besides parking work, so they will be helping out in motor pools, so they be allocated some of their costs to the motor pool fund. So I'm really trying to control costs here, given that we've decreased our revenue stream. The Animal Control Fund, this is where we're paying for all of our animal enforcement expenses of $234,000 and a stable levy of $40,000. Here again, if revenues come in stronger than anticipated or expenses come in less, they basically generate a profit in the year, and those profits stay within the fund. So they have about $70,000 of accumulated profits in the fund since 2013.
And that's derived from license fee and fines associated with pet issues?
Right.
Okay.
And if they don't spend all of their money.
Okay.
When we look at the animal licensing, this next chart shows that we are seeing a decline in our revenues. We're seeing a decline in what I would say is compliance with licensing. You can see that in 2016, we licensed 4,045 dogs, that in 2018 dropped to 3,900, and now in 2019, because most of our licensing is done for the year, because we'll start issuing new licenses come Thanksgiving, is 3,800. And cats, we were at a high of 1,900, and that we're now down in the low 1,800 range.
Now, we are still receiving, I believe we are still receiving rabies vaccine data from the vet clinics, aren't we? So then
Yes.
they can follow up. If a pet is vaccinated but not licensed, that data comes into City Hall, and they're able to follow up with the person and say, we see that you vaccinated an animal, now it's time for your license, and they're able to follow up on those case by case. I don't know what else we could do to ensure better compliance. We raised the non-compliance fees to the point where they're awfully painful. And, we did allow kind of a buyback for the microchip, which kind of makes sense for people to do it. But, I would certainly hope that we'd stay stable on that. And, with a population that is not decreasing, you'd certainly think the pet population isn't decreasing either. So hopefully we can figure out where that loss is coming from.
One of the other things that we've noticed, because the revenues are dropping as a result of microchipping, we do give that discount for microchipping. And I do think that more and more people are microchipping their pets. And so that discount is impacting a larger population of the licensed animals. And so I think that's having an impact on our revenues as well.
Well, we also have a substantial discount for spay-neuter.
Yes.
And so, which we also, we don't want to take that away because we want people to hinder their pets' ability to make more unwanted pets. So, that's a benefit to the animal owner. It does impact our revenue, but I think if it's an issue with noncompliance and we're still doing the same level of follow-up, maybe we need to take a look and see what else we can do there to get people to comply. Because I think people are getting new pets every day. And I
Yeah.
think we're getting reports from the shelter as well when people adopt.
I'm sure there's no less dogs and cats in the city, but
Right.
yeah, looking at the numbers, the microchipping and the spay neuter, that helps understand the loss of the raw revenue dollars, but number of animals is decreasing also. So that's what concerns me, that there's a lack of either follow-up or checking those vaccination records. Now, I know the city changed licensing databases, was that 2 years ago or was that last year? Would that have any
I
effect?
think it was 3 years ago.
3 years?
I don't think so, because we send the same reminder notices that they
Yeah.
send. You know, we replicated our program, you know, after their program. And then, you know, people can purchase their license online, just like they could through pet data.
They're just not doing it.
Yeah. And we did talk to the police department. They have a individual who kind of is a media person, and we, you know, strategized a bit about trying to get the word out a little bit more of the importance of licensing. And I do think it got a lot of media press when we, you know, went to this new revenue structure a number of years ago, and maybe we've, you know, we
Now
need
that
to
we-
push that again.
Right, and now that we have, you know, also, I mean, we've made the process to license your pet easier. I mean, whether it was through pet data or through taking it in-house, it's easier to buy your license online. You can pay with credit card. There's not a lot of cash handling anymore. Years ago, before we had that capability, we had talked about maybe seeing if we could get either the Humane Society, vet clinics, or pet shops to sell our license to pet people, so they don't have to make a trip down here and do what needs to be done. There was not a whole lot of interest in that, because not a lot of people wanted to handle our money. But if it's a matter of, you know, bringing something up on a computer screen, turning it around, and that person, you know, at the point of sale, pays with their own credit card and buys their own license, just to facilitate the online transaction, maybe that outreach would be worthwhile again. I think the relationship between us and the shelter has improved considerably
I
from
think
what
that's
it was years ago.
I think that's an idea that we are using in various banking and credit union institutions, which have the ease with which to pay your property taxes at the facility rather than coming in here to City Hall and doing it at your own schedule and your own location. I think this is something that we should revisit with clinics, veterinarians, as well as other shops that have the ability. Okay, you're right here, you are due. In fact, it should be probably something that, I don't know, have we visited that aspect with the,
Not for a few years.
with
At least,
veterinarians saying you're out of date and here's what you need to do?
we haven't visited it with them, I would say probably in 3 or 4 years. But maybe that's something that we could take up and talk about in public health and safety again. That's where we do animal license stuff. So I could put that on future agenda, probably not in time for the 2020 budget, but we may be able to stave off the trend if we can figure it out and, you know, right the ship for next year. So I'll make a note for myself to take that up in December perhaps, or November.
And I do think, you know, looking at the budget too for the animal licensing, you know, the stray cats at the Humane Society continue to be a financial burden for the city. That is one area where I think the budget showed growth in, and, you know, certainly is something that we could look at if we were looking to control costs, is try to figure out another means of managing stray cats.
It's difficult because the cost per cat includes so much.
Yeah.
And part of the issue that we've always had is the shelter will retain those pets to full capacity and hold them for a very, very long time. And, you know, the ones that are sick or are not adoptable or are, you know, too feral to be handled, they have a different plan for those. But the ones that signal that they're even remotely adoptable can spend an awful lot of time there. And so that's, I mean, it's a hindrance to their budget, and, you know, the cost of the cat contract per cat is not cheap. We've worked to get containment on that, but it's awfully expensive. And you really, I mean, you can kind of predict what you're going to take in a year, but you don't know which year you're going to find a, you know, animal hoarder and have to take a whole bunch. You just don't know.
So then the last two funds in the enterprise fund are the water and sewer. These are self-sustaining. So the 2020 budget for water projects about a $200,000, $270,000 net income for the year, and it includes the rate increase that was adopted in August. And the wastewater expects a profit about 900 some thousand dollars, and it includes the rate increase that was passed in February. Again, those two funds are totally self-sustaining and don't rely on property taxes at all. So looking at kind of our continued budget influences, we kind of go through this list every year. Increasing service demands, we definitely see that in the police department. Our increasing assets and asset maintenance, I think, are all extremely proud of the fact that we have really stepped up our parks to something that we can all be very proud of. But with those better assets come larger maintenance costs. An ongoing influence is state legislation that limits our revenues. On the revenue side, again, that tax rate pressure and our stagnant state aids, lack of diverse revenue sources. From a cost standpoint, just our regular cost of living increases. Certainly this year, health insurance is going to be an issue. Staffing level pressures. Last year, we increased the number of FTEs, which of course we funded mid-season. So then we have to fund the balance of those new positions this year. And I think, there seems to be continued staffing pressures within some of the departments. And then, growing deferred maintenance. We've talked about that on an ongoing basis on our streets. So those are basically our continued budget influences. The work that we have yet to do is to manage the health insurance once we find out what our final number is going to be. You can see that we have nothing built into the budget at this point of option 3. We will have that for you once we have our final insurance costs in. We still are waiting for our final assessed value, and we will likely do a second round of expense review given some of the challenges that we've got going with the health insurance. So some years it's great because the budget is, wraps up pretty easily. This year, it's not going to, unfortunately.
And I'm glad you brought up option 3. I mean, that was a point of contention in the HR committee. It was a point of contention in here. And, our agreement was that we would fund option 2 that we knew we could afford, and then endeavor to, not guarantee, endeavor to fund option 3 if we could do it. But the trouble that we had with option 3 from the get-go is that it increases our cost to continue going forward in perpetuity. And our cost to continue from implementing option 3 is so high. I'm afraid that we will paint ourselves into a corner, and we'll get to a point where if there are staffing needs in a department, or there's, pressures on, for wage disparity or compression or whatever it is, we're not going to be able to afford to solve any of it because we're too busy spending everything we have on pretending that or economically pretending the recession didn't happen. And, I get the fact that, that's a hot spot with a lot of employees. But our salary study also indicated that the vast majority are at or above market rate already. And, there's some pretty, in spite of the health insurance expense, there are some pretty great benefits that come with public employee. And so I think we need to be cautious with our discussion of option 3 when we get those numbers, because where that meets the road every single year, our cost to continue is out of sight with that. And that's part of the concern that HR Chair McElhaney had from the get-go. And, that whole discussion got personified by the workforce as you're either for us or against us, depending on which you support. And that's not the case. You can be pro-employee and you can be pro-workforce and still understand that there's some things you just can't pay for. And I think that's where we're going to find ourselves in a few weeks. And we may be looking at a stare down from our workforce. And we may have a contentious discussion even amongst council members, because there's a split among the 10 of us who are here as far as what we feel employees are entitled to or owed. And so that's going to be a tough one.
So that really is all I have as far as the presentation is concerned. As I said, we're waiting for the insurance numbers. I think the goal on the insurance is to get something towards the end of next week, and then bring that to a joint finance and HR meeting on, at the next regular,
Tuesday?
yeah, next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday.
Would that be next Tuesday or the Tuesday? after?
Wait, that is
The
the
following Tuesday.
22nd.
Yes. on the
22nd, so that gives us a whole extra week.
Right.
Do you think that we need a workshop session in between, or should we wait and try to do one after? After the 22nd? To kind of wrap up our loose ends and figure out how we're going to manipulate things to get to a final rate. And I think we're stalled without the health insurance numbers, so maybe next week doesn't make sense. If we have some numbers on the 22nd, we can deal with just that HR portion, the insurance portion, and then the rest of the budget, we maybe should try to look down the calendar and see if we could get a quorum for maybe the 24th, 23rd, 24th, somewhere in there, to see what, I'm not sure what everyone's calendars look like, but if we could get, or even into that last week, because we really need to get to council with a finished product by the 12th of November, so we can have that public hearing on the budget. So we have a little bit of time, but we don't have the luxury of a ton of time. So why don't we plan to have our next update on the 22nd at our normal meeting, and then we'll try to put our calendars together and see what we can do for a working session later that week, if
Yeah,
that
it-
would work?
It doesn't look like there's any other meetings on the 24th from a city perspective.
Let me check county.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good too, because we run into conflict with them sometimes on Thursday. Tentatively, I have the 24th open. So if that, but not the 23rd. We'll have to just kind of, maybe what we can do is pull out our calendars on the 22nd and see where we land.
County
for an
board
extra-
is 22nd at 7:30, so it's a 6:30 city council that night.
On the 22nd, so the
Yeah.
24th would be probably open then? if-
24th is open.
Okay, maybe let's keep a placeholder for that tentatively? Budget
Yeah,
three.
budget three.
Budget three.
Do you
I
have a
think if there's
preference?
no other meeting, is 5:30 okay? Maybe wrap it up a little earlier?
Okay.
Okay, let's put a placeholder on our calendars then for 10:24 at 5:30.
We'll send out an invite and we'll put it on the city calendar
Yeah.
tomorrow. Okay. And then is there any, if you have any areas that you want us to dive deeper into, we can certainly do that at that time.
That's true, because as we have our back and forth in that budget three, we may need some additional numbers, and that may cause us to need a quick fourth meeting.
Yeah, maybe what we could do on the 22nd is talk about the agenda of what we all would like to talk about more on the 24th.
We could do that.
Okay.
Bring some points of concern, if there's numbers that we know that we're going to need her to go back and get.
Yep,
And some, maybe consider some options and see what we would save or cost based on some of our, proposed changes or cuts. Okay, let's settle on that. And then this is the only item on our agenda tonight, so does anyone have questions for Mary Ann before we go? If not, then a motion to adjourn would be appropriate, and then we'll have our normal meeting on the 22nd.
I'll move to adjourn.
Motion by Nutting, is there a second? Second by Smith. Members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, opposed? None are opposed, motion carries. Thanks, everyone.